So greetings to everyone. Bienvenue. I'm Shauna Van Praagh. I'm a professor of law at McGill and this year's coordinator of the Macdonald Langstaff workshop series. And it's a real honor to welcome all of you to Montreal, to McGill, to the Faculty of Law, to the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, and to this first workshop. Macdonald Langstaff was the first woman to earn a law degree in Quebec. She did so as a single mother and graduated from McGill in 1914 with first-class honors. But she wasn't permitted to write her exams for the Quebec bar, and over the 6 decades that she worked as a legal assistant, she continued to fight for women's equality, especially with respect to the right to vote, and eventually in 1941, women were indeed admitted and welcomed to the bar in Quebec. Macdonald Langstaff was posthumously admitted in 2006 to the Bar of Montreal and received the Medal of Honor, which is kept and looked after at our Faculty of Law. So this year's series is organized around what I thought would be a unifying and inspiring theme for all of us, leading the change, the potential and power of women in law. Over the summer, I spoke with Nandini Ramanujam, who has the wonderful and important and sometimes daunting responsibility of directing the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism at McGill. And I was delighted to receive from the center an offer to sponsor and support the Macdonald Langstaff workshops. And indeed, it's through the center that we have our very precious connection to our first speaker, that is Nandini and Yvonne Dausab have a good and long-lasting relationship. So a relationship between the Department of Justice in Namibia and the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. And indeed, the invitations to all of our speakers throughout this year are grounded in connections to members of our center, members who are faculty professors, members who are doctoral students. And I want to just pause here and before we start the workshop, give a special thanks to Sharon Webb and to Elise Mallette, a third-year law student connected to the center, for all of their assistance and support. But in mentioning connections to doctoral students, this brings me to the second unique feature of the series this year, and that is the significant participation of women doctoral students at McGill's Faculty of Law who come from around the world and who will indeed lead the change as remarkable women jurists. So this, so the collaboration with the center and with our doctoral students, I think, promises real strength and success of the Macdonald Langstaff workshop series this year, and I hope serves as a testament to Macdonald Langstaff herself. So for this first workshop, our doctoral student comes from Sri Lanka, Vishakha Wijenayake, and she's going to introduce our guest in detail and then launch a dialogue for which she has prepared questions, and we will have a back and forth between Vishakha and the Minister of Justice from Namibia. I would ask participants not to use the chat function during the dialogue, which will go from now till roughly 11 o'clock. But then as of 11, or perhaps a little bit before, we'll watch the time, we will open up to questions from the audience, and you can either write those questions in the chat to me. I'm one of the hosts of the session, and I will pass them on, or if you want to use the little blue hand function, that's fine also, and I will moderate that and try to give time to as many people as possible to pose short questions. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Vishakha, who is going to introduce our first speaker this morning here in Montreal, but as I understand, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so maybe tea time in where our guest is. Vishakha.
Thank you, Professor Van Praagh. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you the Minister of Justice of Namibia, Honorable Yvonne Dausab. Justice Minister Dausab has had an inspirational life dedicated to upholding human rights. She grew up in Namibia while under apartheid rule. She completed her BA Law and LLB studies at the University of Western Cape from 1993 to 1997 with a full scholarship from the Legal Assistance Center. And she subsequently completed her LLM in Human Rights and African Democratization at the University of Pretoria in 2001 through a scholarship from the Center for Human Rights. At the age of 25, she became a legal practitioner for the High Court of Namibia. She has worked for a Zambian NGO in private law practice and as a law lecturer and deputy dean at the University of Namibia. In 2015, she was appointed by the President of Namibia as the chairperson of Namibia's Law Reform and Development Commission. Now, as of March 2020, she holds the esteemed position of Minister of Justice of Namibia. She has graciously accepted the invitation to speak about the potential and power of women in law at this first Annie Macdonald Langstaff workshop. Now, my first question to you, Minister of Justice, is whether joining the legal profession was an ambition of yours since childhood, and was there a particular reason you were drawn towards human rights law in particular?
Thank you very much, Vishakha, you said. I think your introduction is very kind. I have forgotten some of it a little bit, because one gets so busy, doing work and also getting busy with so many things. Among them, of course, is to maintain my relationship with McGill University, particularly the center. And I regret that this year I was unable to invite one of the interns. We've had a long and very fruitful relationship with the center. So not having that intern with us this year is something that I certainly miss, because having them in the office is very, very valuable. So to get back to your question, it's a very difficult but also emotional answer I'm going to give you, in the sense that there were a number of key things that led me to wanting to firstly become a lawyer at a very, very young age, but also to venture into what I would now consider human rights activism. The first of it, of course, is the fact that I grew up during apartheid, and I lived in a township called Kadutura, and Kadutura in the Oshiherero language actually means that we did not want to go there. So our ancestors at the time were uprooted very violently by the apartheid regime and relocated. So it was really an internal displacement, if you ask me, from a kind of human rights perspective. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, of course, I lived in an area that was infested with gangsterism, and we were exposed to a lot of, violence and fights between gangs. And you even if you at a young age did not see it necessarily, you heard about it, and you're always wondering that somebody would have committed a crime and they would not easily be found because of where they found themselves in that society. But the third and maybe a more important reason was the fact that at a very young age I experienced I saw gender-based violence when an aunt of mine was brutally killed by her boyfriend then. And, at that young age, all I could think about is what kind of justice system do we have in place that will ensure that my aunt's death justice will be served, so that we as a family could somehow find some kind of closure. So those were the three key experiences in my life that made me think about wanting to become a lawyer. At the time, I did not understand what a lawyer looks like and what the profile of a lawyer is. Of course, now I understand that there's prosecution, there's defense, and all of that. But I knew that if I needed to do something about that kind of situation repeating itself, and of course, over the years, those kinds of situations repeat themselves, but is there a role that I can play? Is there a contribution that I can make in that area? So that would be the long and short of why I ventured into that area.
Thank you very much for sharing those personal experiences with us. I would also like to ask you that we noticed that in your illustrious career, you worked both as a human rights practitioner in courts, as well as Deputy Dean at the University of Namibia. In your view, what distinct contributions have academics and practicing lawyers made to advance social justice in Namibia?
So the biggest debate at the moment, and I find myself in the fortunate position that I have kind of come full circle. Not only was I in private practice where you're chasing fees, but I've also, when I finished law school, I actually came back and worked for the Legal Assistance Center, where I was exposed to impact type of litigation. And, impact type of litigation at the time, I mean, now as a policymaker, the perspective is slightly different. But at the time, dealing with issues, for example, of allegations of police brutality, dealing with issues like challenging the constitutionality of for instance, the criminalization of cannabis at the time, dealing, of course, with also issues like HIV/AIDS litigation. You'd understand that right at the beginning, things like HIV/AIDS could be used as a basis for exclusion, and you needed to fight that. So some of the highlights of the work at the Legal Assistance Center involved that. But of course, when you come from apartheid, you are also exposed to key questions around social justice. And social justice as in fights for the ordinary man on the street. And it may not be big cases, but you're talking here about, for instance, maintenance. How do we address issues of maintenance, questions around married persons equality. And so those kinds of discussions were driving some of the agenda that the Legal Assistance Center was pushing. So that was kind of right at the beginning, but to answer your question, Vishakha, I need to just say that the debate has become a little bit more pronounced over the past 5.5 years or so, when the Law Society of Namibia, of which I'm a member, discussion started about the Change Project. How do lawyers get involved? How do we use the law as a tool to enhance social justice? What kind of contributions and roles should lawyers play? I don't think we had done that sufficiently, right after independence. So that question started to come up. But I can tell you some of the ways that lawyers were making for me, very small contributions towards enhancing social justice had to do with the kinds of scholarships that would come through established organizations like the Namibian Lawyers Associations or the Law Society of Namibia or the Women Lawyers Association. So, the profession started to organize itself. So scholarships was one way of making some kind of contribution, maybe a long shot off because you're focusing on the immediate qualification of an individual, but you're hoping that that individual will come home and contribute firstly to their personal life and support their families and provide for them, but also kind of the long-term project of becoming lawyers that will be socially conscious and that would want to make a difference in the lives of our people. And then there's also the aspect of pro bono work that lawyers do, and also pro amicus courier type of work in courts, where courts may need the support of the independent legal profession to provide legal services to clarify important public interest issues, for instance. So it, lawyers now needed to have to play that role. The role that they've not played sufficiently, in my view, is their role in going to court. Because you'd imagine justice imperatives are driven by, for example, the kinds of jurisprudence that is produced by courts. Now, courts can only produce transformative jurisprudence, if you like, if the people that participate in it, in other words, lawyers, whether it's prosecution or defense counsel, make the kind of contribution. If their papers present, for example, the kind of content and arguments that courts would want to accept, so that it changes the legal paradigm in the society. So it really depends on whether lawyers can play a more aggressive role as activists, and we don't have enough of that. We don't have enough human rights activists as lawyers. I mean, I can count, if somebody asked me, do you know a human rights lawyer? I would be able to count them on one hand, not because they're not there, but there isn't enough of that kind of activism. So I think that contribution, of course, lawyers do a lot of social responsibility work, something that they would not always publicize, but we know that they do some of that work. But the question really is it sustainable kind of social responsibility work that they do? Because that question would respond to enhancing of social justice. Because social justice, I'm sure you agree with me, is not a once-off project. It's transformative. It needs to transform the society. And if we don't see a transformation of our society, it may be difficult to say that we have done enough as lawyers in our country to enhance that trajectory.
I would like to follow up with you on, you use the words human rights activist to describe yourself.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you what activism really means to you. I mean, I think you elaborated that a bit in the previous answer, but also what advice you would give to students who are passionate about social justice and consider careers in human rights.
So where you come from has a huge impact on what kind of activism you undertake. You could be an activist that is arm's length. In other words, you sit around the desk and you speak up and speak out on social media about the issues that are affecting our society. But the kind of activism that I've experienced, certainly growing up in the kind of society and background that I come from, one of, for example, lack of material wealth, one of having to be subjected to apartheid, which is living separate lives and being excluded purely on the basis of your skin color, and being excluded, educationally, socially, and otherwise, does make you so you clearly you have experience, and it was your lived reality. It may not be so now, and that certainly makes a huge difference. So understanding context, both historic and current context, is extremely important, and not from a kind of top-down, I have the answers type of way, but in a way that is meaningful, but also empathetic and really understanding. So not in a kind of way that you take pictures with people that you consider to be vulnerable and to pose those pictures with the impression that you understand what their plight is. So you need to know and understand plight. But the other, which is what I have as an advantage, is that even though I have pulled myself out of the conditions that I have grown up in, some of my family members continue to still live those realities. And that makes a huge difference in understanding the plight of particularly vulnerable communities. So activism is about understanding, but activism is also about sacrifice. And it's difficult if you cannot sacrifice, if you cannot also let go of some of your own privileges and acknowledging them, that you have them. For example, I live, I've lived the dual, because I've come from lack of wealth, and I continue not to have generational wealth, for example. So my family still lives that. But I have had a scholarship, I've had foreign education, for instance. I've come back and I have been employed, and I have had the basic amenities of life. So in that sense, I'm enjoying some privilege, and then I need to acknowledge that, but I need to know, where have I come from? What are the things that I've done to get there? I was a student activist as well. So if you want to be an activist, you really need to understand the fights that you're fighting. And you must never pretend to talk for anyone and to understand, because you have better knowledge. And normally book knowledge doesn't mean that you can be a better speaker for the people who are actually going through those challenges. So am I activist, Vishakha? I think deep down I am. I am a policymaker now, but I must sometimes remind myself that I am actually a policymaker. I'm in government, and I need to do the things that I've been fighting government for. Now that I'm in a position of power and influence, I need to acknowledge that. And it's not always difficult. It's a very delicate balance to maintain. But I think, I don't think I can ever, once an activist, always an activist. And activism is different things, it's understanding. For example, we had protest 2 weeks ago, and I was in the crowd, even though, and they were looking for me to hand over a petition, and so that's the activist in me, understanding that some issues you don't need to politicize. Some issues are just about expression.
Thank you for that great, insights into what it means to be an activist. But I would also like to ask you, now that you are the Minister of Justice of Namibia, are there any ways in which you feel your role has changed? But how do you keep the experiences you had in the past? How do they influence you in your role?
So at the risk of repeating what I said earlier, but just to say that I was a student activist, both in Namibia and South Africa, and that has had a huge impact on, the advantage I have is I understand how, in a way, activism works, and how I should engage issues when they're brought to my attention. That certainly helps. The fact that I lacked material wealth growing up helps me understand the issues that are brought forth by members of the public. And I'm very, very sensitive. I am also very, very compassionate. One of the first things I did, and this is part of that activism at play, was I set up a social responsibility project during the coronavirus and the state of emergency, so that I could have, I couldn't just tell people that you cannot leave your house, and that I was able to say, here is a parcel of food and some clothing that can help you, weather the storm while we're going through this difficult time. So, and again, that's understanding that it's not enough, to say to people, this is the policy, this is the law, this is how we'll do it, and setting out processes. That's one important part, but it's also to show people that you understand, and that you're hearing what they're saying. So, and I think and I don't want to repeat this, Vishakha, because I've covered it, but just to say that because, we come from families that continue to struggle, it makes you realize the family and friends and people that in areas that you grew up, that you went to school with. And these people have access to you, so people would let you know what's going on, and people have been very forthcoming about what are some of the solutions that we have in solving some of the key challenges that we face as a country. So it helps to have been part of this kind of life, and it gives you that kind of advantage than someone who completely comes from a privileged background and has to kind of identify with these kinds of struggles that people have.
Yes, so you were speaking about the kind of human rights challenges that you have to address today. Can you elaborate a bit more on whether there are any particular human rights challenges today in Namibia that affect women in particular? And
of course, topping the list at the moment, and if you've been watching news and in the international media, you would have noticed that 2 weeks ago we had major shut it all down protests in Namibia, and it had to do primarily with sexual and gender-based violence in the country. We've had, and we are not very proud of this characteristic that has started to show itself of increasing number of women being raped and killed at the hands, in many instances, of their lovers. But something that has been very, very disturbing for us in recent weeks is the raping of very young children, particularly by their family members, by uncles and so forth. So femicide, whether we like it or not, is a really is a huge problem, I find, in recent weeks, and the Namibian public had stood up. So that obviously disproportionately affects women in Namibia. I think there is a challenge around LGBTQI rights. We're struggling as a nation with defining what that should look like for us, and obviously it's also starting to, people are also starting to ask questions around it, and we really need to start asking ourselves as a nation, is this something that we need to talk about? Because we haven't gotten to a place of comfort where we could openly have the discussions. Of course, the discussions are happening in the LGBTQ community. When I was at the Law Reform and Development Commission, there was a proposal for repeal of sodomy laws in our country, and there's been some discussions around increased protection mechanisms for that community. So and that obviously also affects women in a significant way. The third, there are a number of key ones, but I think I want to stick with three. The third one is questions around the huge disparity of income inequality and how that affects the economic empowerment of women in Namibia. And if you look at the statistics around coronavirus in any jurisdiction, including our own, you would notice that coronavirus has had a disproportionate impact on women, whether it's in respect of them being subjected to domestic violence, losing of jobs, that the impact of corona, whether it is a male person or a husband or a boyfriend losing a job, the impact is greater on the women than it would be on any other person. So those, I think, would be the key ones that I can think of that is affecting us as a country at the moment.
Thank you, Justice Minister. I think it really highlights not only the way women experience certain issues, but the intersectionality of
yes.
overlapping concerns like economic issues as well.
Yes.
With that in mind, I would like to ask you whether the international human rights framework has been used in Namibia to address these issues in any way?
Yes.
And are there any challenges in incorporating human rights standards in local contexts, such as Namibia?
Yes, thank you very much. A good question. One of the great things about our constitution is Article 144, which basically, transposes international law into domestic law. So under this constitutional provision, once we have ratified an international instrument and we have ratified, all the key international Bill of Rights, CAT, CEDAW, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Economic and Social Rights. We've ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So if there is a country, and I'm sure there are many other jurisdictions that have done so, Namibia has an impressive track record of ratifying and acceding to international instruments. And the advantage of this is that because of Article 144 of the Namibian Constitution, technically, it actually makes Namibia a moneist country. But of course, and this would answer your latter question, which is how international instruments have been used either as a protection mechanisms and the systems that you normally use it, apart from the ministries, offices, and agencies, which would, through their reporting and their implementation, would take on some of the characteristics of international instruments. We also have had our courts actually refer to international instruments, particularly when there is when the safeguards in the domestic statutory or common law did not have additional safeguards. So when we had a gap in the domestic setup, whether it's a statute or a policy, we would always make reference to international instruments. It is helpful though, and we've seen this with many other instruments that we've ratified. It is helpful to have an enabling statute, because if you don't have an enabling statute, and we have many for many of the international instruments we've ratified, is that then your courts have to rely on other jurisdictions to interpret what that means and how and Canada is a popular one actually. We make reference because of your own constitutional jurisprudence, we make reference to Canadian cases to assist our courts. And that kind of interpretation normally has persuasive value in the Namibian courts. Just the last thing I want to say, Vishakha, is that what is also important is the readiness and preparations that go along with having to sign or ratify international instruments. Whether or not our institutional arrangements are in place, and sometimes the question that we're sitting with, and I certainly grapple with it sometimes, is is it better to first get your institutional arrangements in place and then ratify, or do you ratify and come and have them? And what can fast track the process? My experience is, once you've ratified an international instrument, you want to ensure that everything else is consistent with those obligations that you have, and it makes it sometimes a little bit faster because you will be reviewed, there'll be visits, you need to submit reports and so forth. Now, if you're waiting to first get everything in order, you may not easily ratify. So it's a bit of a challenge, but I think it's something that I've certainly thought about.
Yes, what do you think about the importance of access to justice? Because the grassroots need to have, just as much as the judiciary gives these activist judgments or incorporating human rights standards, how much do the grassroots level people have knowledge of human rights, and how do you think that can be increased?
Extremely important question. Since I became minister, I've been preoccupied with it, because the ministry's key vision is around making the law accessible and to make legal services more available, but also to ensure that legal aid is widely distributed, or rather made available in terms of legal representation and so forth. So I've been thinking about justice. What are justice imperatives? What is access to justice? What does it look like and what does it mean? And of course, when you talk about access to justice, you're talking about a number of things. The first thing that you're talking about really is courts. You know, do we have infrastructure, court infrastructure ready and available? And once your court system and infrastructure is available, what is the quality of that infrastructure? That also determines access to justice. The second one is your availability of human resource capacity. So do you have prosecutors, enough prosecutors for each courtroom? Do you have magistrates or presiding officers, you know, that are available to hear cases, for instance? And even if people are available, you know, do you have competent people that are available? Do they understand substantive law? Do they understand, for example, procedural law? So do you have competent and available people? And then it's the place of your other parties, which is your defense, your accused and your defense, but also in civil proceedings, it's the question around equality of arms, for instance. So, and when you talk about that, it's availability of legal representation and competent legal representation, for instance. And here you're looking at not only legal aid, government-funded legal aid, you're also talking about, the independent legal profession, making themselves a bit more available for pro bono work. There is a proposal to amend the Legal Practitioners Act so that we can find some kind of, we want to actually impose, in a nice way, of course, that legal practitioners find ways of increasing their pro bono work and to introduce a culture of pro bono work. So when you talk about access to justice, but the other important one, which I've mentioned before, is what kind of jurisprudence are we developing? What kind of cases are coming out of court? The role of community courts, and I'm in the process, the ministry is in the process of establishing a small claims court. I don't know whether there are small claims courts in Canada, but it's something that we think will be, affordable, and it will be accessible, and it will be widely available. But 2 weeks ago, I was in the field visiting our community courts, because the Minister of Justice is responsible, has the oversight function for community courts, and then I realized that our community courts, which is your traditional courts, need to be capacitated, because one thing you are sure of is not only do they enhance, your community cultural practices, but they are within the system. They are in the communities. People don't have to think about traveling, for instance. They don't have to think about money. They don't have to think about being exposed to a system that they're unfamiliar with, because that system embraces their practices. So it's a nice to have, and I think that we have a great opportunity now, to enhance that capacity, so that it doesn't become a place of punishment, but it becomes a place associated with restorative justice. It's the one place where you have restorative justice, because you would imagine that your normal courts are based on the notion of punishment primarily, whereas your community courts, traditional courts, have that very endearing aspect of restoring somebody in the position that they were before a particular incident had taken place. So access to justice is an important conception, but it's also very closely linked with social justice.
Thank you very much, Minister, for highlighting the different ways in which we can look at justice, not only as a punitive measure, but this very plural understanding of having also restorative justice in the system. But you also mentioned the need to have competent prosecutors and lawyers as well as judiciary. I would like to know what kind of representation and diversity is there in terms of the judiciary and the bar in Namibia, especially with regard to female lawyers?
Yes, a very good question. I don't have the statistics, Vishakha, and I apologize for that. But I can tell you that female lawyers have actually become quite a sizable contingent of the independent legal profession. I can tell you at the university, 60% of the student population is actually female, and that runs across the law school as well. What I can tell you also is that Namibian women, through an organization called the Namibian Women Lawyers Association, have actually come together and organized themselves, quite apart from the Law Society of Namibia and the Namibian Lawyers Association. So it's important, and that kind of organization and organizing yourself, it also helps with deciding, what are the types of cases that you will take on, for instance. I remember being criticized very heavily many years ago when I was in private practice, when I had taken a principled decision that I cannot represent someone that is accused of rape, for instance. And people had criticized me because they were saying, yeah, but everybody is innocent until proven guilty. How can you prejudge and so forth? And I said, no, I'm not prejudging anyone. What I'm saying is I'm taking a conscious decision not to participate in the defense of someone that I would, as a woman ourselves, we are all, kind of subject, and that's why your MI Next movement was based on the fact that, as women, you have the potential that at some point you may be sexually violated, regrettably, and maybe not sexual violence in its crude terms, but also in its subtle kinds of ways, where you are exposed to subtle, harassment at the workplace, and those kinds of things. So, Vishakha, I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question, but I'm saying to you that, and I have a habit. You must watch me. I have a habit. If I don't agree with your question, I will answer you. I may even reframe your question to give you the answer that I think is most appropriate. But that's a skill I've learned from talking to doctoral students like yourself. So.
No, I think you've been answering the question so far. So I'm quite happy with that. But I wanted to ask you, given that now you're a woman in one of the highest governmental positions in Namibia, whether your position is representative of women's participation in politics in general in Namibia, firstly, and what advice you would have for women who do occupy leadership positions?
Yes, absolutely. I think Namibia, I remember in 2016, Namibia was actually ranked the 10th highest country, I think, in Africa that had women, a large contingent of women in politics and decision-making, which I thought was quite an impressive record. At the moment, I think the ruling party, of which I'm a member, has a policy entrenched in their constitution that says, when we make decisions about, for example, the party list, it will be on a zebra style, so 50-50. So, for example, when you have 96 women standing on the party list, you'd have, number one would be a man and two would be a woman or whatever, but so that is one great policy of the ruling party, and that has assisted in really infusing women into, particularly in politics. I can tell you, of the 96 or 104 members of the National Assembly, 44 of them are women. And out of 16 deputy ministers, 12 of them are women. And so, and out of 21 ministers, 10 of us are women. So I think on that one, you can see we are really pushing for at least having 50% gender parity in our key decision-making bodies. I think there are areas that needs some changes. I've now seen increasingly in the banking sector. I think the Bank of Namibia can do better with their top leadership in terms of having more women there. But three of our main banks actually have women as managing directors. And I think that's impressive, because in the financial sector, that was not something that was coming through quite nicely. So even in the corporate sector, I think the corporates can do a little bit better. I think a government and particularly in the political space, political decision-making space, I think we have certainly done much, much better than the corporate sector when it comes to that. So what would be my advice? I think maybe 2-3 things. The one is we must understand that this is a competitive space, and you need to have the knowledge. So if it means spending longer hours to read up and so that, not because you're competing with anyone, but you need to do the work, and you need to have the knowledge, and you need to develop the skills. For example, if you were shy and you couldn't stand up to speak in the National Assembly or in Parliament, maybe sharpen your skills, your oratory skills, for instance, so that you are able to engage with issues, so that you are able to articulate. You must remember, when you're in decision making, you are actually, it's a constitutional imperative. You are a representative of the people. And whether you like it or not as a woman, when a woman is in power and is in a position of influence, there is an expectation that that woman will be speaking for us. And so you must be in the know about what are the issues and the challenges that women are facing, and how you should articulate them. This is extremely important. So just to say that, it's not a walk in the park. You're going to get some pressure. You're going to get some patriarchal tendencies of people reminding you in some instances that they've brought you there, even though you have gotten there on your own, for instance. And you have to remember those dynamics and to remember why you are there in the first place, and once you understand your why, about why you find yourselves in the spaces that you do, you need to do the things that you need to do to push that particular agenda forward.
Yes, I would like to take a step back a bit and discuss the female representation in leadership positions in Namibia. I'm interested to know why there's a high percentage of women. Is it because of grassroots women's rights activism, or is it more a top-down approach, that a policy level decision taken by the government? I'm just interested to know why there's such a positive result in terms of female participation.
I think, of course, when you come from a background, historical background of apartheid, everything, constitutionally speaking, of course, is about getting rid of the isms first. So you want to make sure that you don't have racism, you don't have sexism, and so you're driving, so your historical entry point becomes a catalyst for driving out any kind of inequalities. I think it is uncomfortable coming from the kind of background that we've come, that would allow any kind of activity that looks down or that excludes or that separates us from each other. So the first place, of course, is the fact that we had the kind of constitutional language that was supporting not only democracy, but that was also supporting very clearly a culture of non-discrimination and a culture of equality. And that's important, because that becomes your frame of reference, if you'd like. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, of course, all of us, you know, when you, again, historically, we were all activists, you know, and so activism, particularly the women's movement in Namibia, was very strong. I mean, if you look at some of the people that we are looking up to, you know, Beans governors who's had made her mark at the level of the African Union, for instance, was an activist. So when they, post 1990, some of the first things that you wanted to change is the gender equality paradigm. And so one of the first pieces of legislation that came through after independence was the Married Persons Equality Act of 1996, an important drive to just drive that kind of language and culture into the minds of our people. And also, if you look at the text of the Rape Act, although it only came through in 2000, the text and the language in the Domestic Violence Act, you know, that it is again supported by saying we're equal, because we understand, and we see it now more profoundly, now that we're challenging with gender-based violence in the country, that it, you know, you cannot talk about, you know, changing the attitudes of people if you don't change that, firstly, that private-public dichotomy, and you don't change the question around gender equality, you know, and changing the mindset and deconstructing questions around socialization, for instance, because it's the way we are socialized, I'm sure you understand, Vishakha, that also has an impact on how we relate to each other, and whether people really believe that, you know, I want to be beaten because then if you don't beat me, you don't, then you don't love me. All of that stuff, you know, the role of our culture, you know, there are many cultural practices that are useful and that are valuable and that we should maintain, but there are also a lot of harmful cultural practices. And there's also a misconstruction, if you'd like, of some of our cultural practices. Lobola is one of them. You know, the way it has completely been misapplied has led to women being commodified and you know, creating the impression that they're being bored and so forth. So I'm saying a lot of things, but what I'm really saying to you is that, like I initially say, for example, the ruling party had taken a policy decision to have a 50-50 approach to fielding and the appointments into leadership positions.
It's really heartening to see that, you know, oppressive past can really influence positive decision making,
Yeah.
and that it's possible, because there are situations where that has not happened, and to see good examples of contexts where that it actually been put into practice is really really inspiring. But the final question I have for you is a personal one, and that is about being a woman in law school. Especially when I entered law school, it's the first time I was completely confronted with patriarchy. And that continued throughout the legal profession to a certain extent when I was back in Sri Lanka. And I would like to know what you think about how women experience law school, and what kind of challenges did you face as a woman in the legal profession in particular?
So when I was in law school, I took you know, I took some deliberate steps. And remember, I was in law school in South Africa, because at the time when I went to law school in 1993, and now you can figure out how old I am. I know I'm not, I'm not as young. I know I'm young looking and cute, but I'm much older. But to answer your question, Vishakha, really, you have to be deliberate as a woman yourself about what are the things that you will not allow. Of course, there will always be very subtle experiences that you would have. But I can tell you, in practice, as a legal practitioner, and I was working for what would be considered a good law firm, with a certain kind of profile, and you're a Black woman. And those things you can't deny, unfortunately. It makes a huge difference in what kind of environment you find yourself and who you are. And some of the challenges that I had initially was the fact that I was a Black woman coming from a certain kind of background. So my competing resource-wise, for example, was not possible, because I was competing with somebody who had generational wealth and I did not. That's just one tiny example. But I can tell you that as a woman, and I've had these discussions with some of our senior, brilliant women lawyers in practice, one of the biggest challenges they were facing is that whereas they were competing with somebody who had support in the form of his wife or his girlfriend, she was the support, because you had children, whether we like it or not, those roles, that the way we've been socialized, and some of it are choices that we make, is when you have children, when you have a home, there are certain things. So who works overtime? You leave at 7, your counterpart is still sitting, because he doesn't have to worry about kids at home. He doesn't have to worry about cooking and all of that. And those things you still worry about despite being a successful woman. So it's important for us to understand that those dynamics doesn't all of a sudden change because I'm the Minister of Justice. I find myself in the fortunate position that I have a partner at home that I can rely on. And so that is, and it's also the kind of relationship that determines whether or not you can rely on somebody. So those challenges remain. People use this example a lot, but it's the reality. Is that after a meeting, that it's expected that women should, or when there is tea provided, that people are sending you to go and get, yet the meeting is continuing. No one is stopping for tea while you are assisting. So I have no problem to give tea if I choose to. If I ask you, would you like some tea, Vishakha, that's perfectly fine. But to assume that, I will get up and make you that tea, that for me is the challenge. And those things have not disappeared because we find ourselves in positions of power and influence. It's how you organize yourself as an individual that, and to assert yourself to say, no, this is something this is where I draw the line.
Thank you very much, Minister of Justice. I think I've learned quite a lot about being somebody who is passionate about human rights myself. I've learned that being a human rights activist, sometimes people are ashamed to say that they're human rights activists. It's nothing to be ashamed of, or it's nothing that precludes you from being a significant force within the government itself. It's not a dichotomy where you're either you're a human rights activist or you're part of the government.
Yes.
And I also learned how your personal experiences can shape your legal career in positive ways that can help other people. And also learned the ways in which Namibia has come through a system of oppression to incorporate, plural form of justice and incorporate human rights within the legal system, as well as give opportunities and represent women in leadership positions. So those were my main takeaways. I'm sure everybody had, you know, given your respective backgrounds, learned quite a lot from this exchange of ideas.
Thank you.
And I would like to hand over now to Professor Van Praagh, and I'm sure there are many questions from the audience as well.
Okay. Ooh.
Thank you so much to both of you for a wonderful, dynamic, and engaged conversation that covered so many different aspects of what the Minister of Justice's kind of trajectory has been, and obviously the continued projects on the horizon. Lots of things, I think, to keep you busy. And as I listened to you, I felt more and more honored and grateful that you've taken this time to talk with us, because you clearly have a whole lot of things to do, even on a late Friday afternoon. And thank you so much to Vishakha. I think you will all agree that we're so proud of our doctoral students, and Vishakha has done a wonderful job with this first workshop of the year in terms of her preparation, but also curiosity and insight that went into the questions and this interaction with the Minister of Justice. So we do have time now to open up to questions from those of you who have been listening and watching. And as I say, you can either write, I prefer it if you write a question in the chat to me, and then I'll pass it on, just so that we're not kind of distracting everyone with lots of chats to everyone. Or you can use the little blue hand function to let me know that you have a question, and I will watch for participants, and I may actually pick on a couple of colleagues to start us off, actually. So I wondered, I think I'll actually go to Nandini. I mentioned at the beginning that Nandini Ramanujam, who directs our Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, is the person who knew and continues to have a good working relationship with the Honorable Yvonne Dausab. So I wondered, Nandini, as you listened, whether there were new things that you learned, or things that you know our guest hasn't mentioned that you think would be worthwhile sharing with the people at the workshop.
Hello, Yvonne, welcome, and so wonderful to see you. And
yes, afternoon.
I'm deeply grateful for you accepting this invitation. I actually have a question about mentorship. Because every student we have sent over to you comes back with this energized and continues to seek mentorship from you. They see you as a mentor, and they learn so much from you. And I was wondering whether you, when you were in university or as a young woman, did you have a mentor or mentors who you continue to have a relationship with? And the role of a mentor for a woman who is embarking on a professional path.
Yeah, thank you.
What are your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you so much. I feel very, very honored, especially when I was reading up a little bit about Annie Macdonald Langstaff and what she had gone through, that I was the first person that you'd invited. It's an extremely humbling experience. So thank you, Nandini, for, if I may call you that, for facilitating this, but also for remaining engaged. I mean, our meeting was very flitting, actually, and it's amazing how engaged we've remained over the years. So thank you very much to you as well. I also just want to have a shout out to Bianca. I think I saw her I was hoping that some of the others, Eleanor and Calvin, would also have been on. And if they are, and I don't see them, hello to all of you who've had an opportunity to be at the Law Reform and Development Commission. And of course, Nandini, initially, remember, the idea was that I was going to do it at the University of Namibia, but when I moved to law reform, it became a law reform project. Now it will become the minister's project. So that's how I'm going to stick with McGill. But to answer your question, I've never really had someone that I called a mentor, but I certainly had, what I've always done is that if I had any kind of relationship with someone that I could learn from. So for example, I always sought advice from teachers, from lecturers at university, or when I was in the human rights space in Zambia, my executive director there, for example, I would go to him for certain things. So I've never really taken the time to find myself someone that I would call a mentor, but I certainly think I have a plethora of people that I can go to if I had difficult questions that I would need. I mean, for example, now that I'm in government, even the head of state could be someone that I would seek his advice on any particular issue. So it depends on, for me, it depends on the issue that I'm struggling with and who I'm modeling to see would give me the right response. One of the things that I appreciated about the McGill students was their openness to learn. And that's the one thing about being mentored, is you must be willing to learn. You must have what they would call, for those of you who read the Bible, what they would call a teachable spirit. If you don't have that, it's pointless to have a mentor. But the second thing is that you'd understand, and teachable spirit also is linked to an open mind. And but the other great thing was I had also opened myself up to say that teaching and learning is reciprocal. You cannot have, just because I'm the chairperson of law reform, or just because I'm the Minister of Justice, and Nandini, you are the professor, doesn't mean that you cannot learn from someone. And young people have fresh ideas, and that's why when you mentor, sometimes you mentor people without even knowing that you're mentoring them, is that you remain engaged, and that you are honest about the feedback that you give, and also that you are willing to accept sometimes difficult feedback from the youngsters. And something that the McGill students were not shy to do is to express themselves, even if something was uncomfortable for them. So it's difficult to place it in one sentence, Nandini, but I think it's really about openness to communicate honestly.
Thank you very much. I asked, I'm sure there are others.
Yes, so I have a question to pass on to you, actually, from another one of our doctoral students who actually is doing her doctoral work on women in the judiciary in Colombia. So she says some scholars claim that women jurists in positions of power have a different voice or a different way of understanding the law than men do. What is your opinion on this claim or this perception? I can imagine that you have responded to people who have suggested that in the past, or have engaged in conversations about that kind of idea. So this is from Maria Sebastros, and I think it's a great question.
I think, yes, I think it's a great question. I think it's also a difficult and complex question, but the easy answer is when you are in the judiciary, whether you're a woman or a man, there are certain things that you come with, certain sensitivities, personal experiences that you bring along. But something that really sets you apart, I suppose, as a woman in particular, is the kinds of experiences that you've lived through. Because you must remember, all women come from a patriarchal society, and because of that experience, there's something unique that you bring to the bench. But you will only provide that scope for bringing a different kind of eye to the kinds of judgments that come through if you are deliberate and conscious about the issues that women face, but also generally issues that society face. It is true that depending on what your underpinning is, and here I'm talking now about theoretical underpinnings. If your theoretical underpinnings are feminism, then that's the lens through which you will look at things. If it's human rights, that will be the lens, and also what kind of ideology you support, so ideologically, the question around class, and also questions around capitalism and socialism and communism, those kinds of issues ideologically may also influence the kinds of judgments that you write. I have said now for the longest time that I find our judges or our bench largely being a little bit positivist, and that has reduced, that has hampered what some constitutional experts and also judges, particularly from the South African Constitutional Court, would call judicial activism. So it really requires, so to answer this very difficult question, I would just say that it really depends on what kind of again, background that you're coming from and what it is that you want to achieve when you're on the bench.
Thank you. So, yes, so you had your wish answered. Bianca has a question or would like to say hello. So Bianca, please unmute and go ahead.
Honorable Minister, it's wonderful to see you, and yes. I had the great privilege of interning with you last summer and learning from you and being blessed with your ongoing mentorship and training. But last year, my question is, last year in Namibia was an extremely exciting time for the nation where a lot of pressing issues were gaining traction prior to the election and prior to your appointment. So my question is, how has the legal landscape in Namibia changed in the past year, especially with regards to Black economic empowerment legislation with NIEF, and as well as the repeal of the sodomy law and legalization of same-sex marriage? And what are your plans for your term on these matters?
Okay, thank you very much. So Bianca, it's wonderful to see you, and I know that you always wanted the title that you were one of my best interns. I think all McGill interns were best in their own way. I still miss your counsel, because your work ethic is in a lot of ways unparalleled. That aside, on NIEF, it's now with the drafters, and NIEF, as you know, because you've worked on it, has for the rest of the audience, it's really about the equivalent of Black economic empowerment in South Africa, but we call it the National Equitable Economic Empowerment Framework, an important piece of legislation for advancing and reducing the income inequality that we face in our country. So it's at an advanced stage, and it will only go, I believe, to the National Assembly, hopefully in the first quarter, because of the local and the regional elections that are coming up in less than a month. The National Assembly will also end its session early, towards the end of October or so. So we're hoping that it will still go through to Parliament. There's, of course, a lot of debate at the moment about, and there's a lot of politicking around it as well. You know, some opposition politicians saying it's creating tension between white and black. We've changed a lot of the language and the objects in the text of the law so that we could ensure that there is a wide distribution of wealth and avoid the possibility of it being concentrated in a small group and so forth. So that's the long and short of that. In light of recent developments around gender-based violence, hopefully next week I'm tabling an amendment to the Domestic Violence Act and also to the Combating of Rape Amendment, Combating of Rape Act. So the hope again is that we strengthen the safeguards to protect women and children, particularly children with disabilities, against sexual violence. And we also hope that the domestic violence emergency protections that we have in place can be better, and that for both those pieces of legislation that we increase victim support. Lastly, the conversation around LGBTQI issues and particularly the sodomy law requires a policy discussion at the level of our cabinet and hopefully also at the level of the National Assembly. So that conversation, we're hoping now with the amendment of the Domestic Violence Act, we can have some conversations around it. But my own position is that, you know, we need to move towards having all Namibians feel that they should not be left out. You know, if we really want to make the Namibian metaphor of the Namibian house a reality. So the difficult conversation, Bianca, but I can tell you it's one that we should have.
Thank you. And thank you so much to Bianca for giving you the opportunity to actually highlight some of these very concrete steps that you're taking. There are a whole lot of steps that you're taking all at the same time, I think, as Minister of Justice. So thank you for the question and thank you for sharing those with us. I wonder, you talked a little bit, you used the word transformative to talk about the possibility of transformative jurisprudence. That was when you were talking about courts and their potential for being transformative, but of course they depend, as you said, on the arguments that come to them and the evidence brought, the stories that they hear, right, that then inform changes to the law. I wondered, as someone who has been teaching for a long time, but I always say, and I was happy to hear you say this too, I feel like I've been learning from my students for a very long time. I wonder about the transformative potential of legal education itself. I think you've touched on that in some of your answers. But I wanted to tie it to something else that you said, which is that it's important not to think that we can, you know, bring solutions top down, to kind of have an attitude of I have the answers. And I wondered if you could talk about that, both that transformative nature of legal education, but also the importance of working together and some humility. Sometimes we talk about legal education as learning how to problem solve, and I always am a little hesitant about using that language, because I actually don't want my students to think that they are all graduating in the world ready to solve all the problems of the people around them, but rather to listen, to work on those problems, to see different perspectives. And so I wondered if you could reflect on some of those ideas.
So I want to start off with something that Professor Horn, who is a very good friend of mine, but also a professor of law and also of theology, calls the hermeneutics of justice. And he defines this as something that has to do with, you cannot have a constitution, and I agree with him on this point, you cannot have a constitution if it is not going to transform the society. And because Namibia, you know, has, you know, the constitution is supreme, And because we are based on a constitutional democracy, it's important for us to understand that that will always be our go-to to start off with. So the question would be, is the constitutional text enough to help us transform our society? Do we have enough language in the Bill of Rights? So do we have enough rights and freedoms that we can use to enhance social justice? Do we have the kind of democratic language that will allow for our societies to engage in a manner that they can, as a collective, lead us to that vision that we're also talking about, to become this great society? So is our constitution the kind of constitution that reflects what the late Justice Muhammad in 1991 in S versus Atchison said reflects is the constitution a mirror that reflects our national soul? So that is the frame of reference, Prof. So to answer your question, yes, of course, legal education is extremely important. Continuing education is even more important, and how we blend the theoretical portions with practical reality. So how engage our students with what is happening in our society? What kind of engagement does our academics have with influencing policy, for example, policy direction in our societies? What kind of engagement do the students and the academics have in the kind of text that our statutes and our laws should have? And if that law and that statute is not consistent with what is expected by our constitution, for example, what role are they playing? So I think if you want to transform a society, of course, your student cohorts are an important part of that transformation, but they will require quite a bit of maybe pushing and pulling a little bit, I think. But another important angle or supplement for legal education, Prof, is clinical education. And here I'm talking about your legal aid clinics at universities, because you're already inculcating a culture of service, something, because most law students, I don't know about those ones in McGill, are thinking about their own life. We a little bit insular, wanting to get the car in the house and get married and have the 2 children and the dog and so forth. That kind of mentality. And we need to change that culture, to one of service, and not just about me. So there's a lot of me when it even comes to law students. And I think clinical education is an important part to introduce them already to that kind of culture of service. The last thing I want to say here, if I may, is that extraordinary judgments transform societies. And if we don't take that seriously, if we don't think about the contribution that we're making, even as doctoral students. I haven't yet started studying my doctorate because I've been struggling to find the kinds of topic that will transform our society. Now having a doctorate has become fashionable. Having a doctorate, you finish it within. When I was hearing about a PhD or a doctoral candidate, it's a person that has lived through life, has taken 10 years before they get their degree, because what they're about to come up with is going to change the scale of events, or it's going to change the profile of our society. So we really, and I think with respect to those who are studying their doctor, I think you are all, Vishakha, I know you're a great doctoral student, and your doctorate will change the way we look at things going forward. But the point I'm making is that you have to be deliberate about, for example, the kinds of programs that you introduce in universities. And I'm sure the center, from what I know of Nandini and her students, that center I know is very, very transformative. And if you've taken on a workshop or a lecture that honors a great human being, may her soul continue to rest in peace, like Annie Macdonald, then I believe that we are moving in a direction where we want to change the way we do things.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to stop, and I think everyone will agree that the Honorable Yvonne Dausab has just brightened our day and also had an impact, I think, on how we see the future. She's so, you have just been so energetic, clearly brilliant, articulate, and inspiring. And I want to borrow what you said and say that as we finish off this first workshop of the year, may we all have teachable spirits and open minds, and may we all feel really inspired from your words today as we go about in all of the projects that we hope cumulatively at least will have an extraordinary impact on our world and in change as we look ahead. So with that, I thank you so much for joining us. If I could, I would go and make some tea for you. I would be honored to offer you tea and sit down to have a cup of tea with you. So I wish I could do that from Montreal all the way to you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I will invite all of our audience to say goodbye for today. I think Nandini may want to stay on for a moment just to chat with you, Madam Minister. And so if you don't mind just staying for a couple of minutes, but I'll say goodbye to everyone else. And as you go, you will have seen in the chat that Charlotte and Joseph, both journalists for the student paper, the McGill Tribune, have been here and are inviting participants to get in touch with them by email if they want to participate in a quick interview for the story that they will write in the McGill Tribune, and we'll make sure that that you get a copy of that story. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. So we'll ask you to stay on for just a moment, and the Center for Human Rights people and Vishakha as well. And thank you to everybody else for sharing your time and for coming to learn together today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. There, Nandini is clapping. Did you hear that?
This was brilliant, really brilliant. We have a sunny morning here and you've added to the sunshine. It's been just brilliant. Everything and beyond what we had hoped for.
Thank you.
And you know, this virtual format is so new to all of us, and you adapted so well to it, and it was really marvelous. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you very much, Nandini. I also enjoyed it, and I love the challenge a little bit. You know, I'm always asking myself, am I thinking enough? And you know, this kind of engagement with institutions of higher learning, particularly an institution with your repute, is important for me. I've said it in another platform, and I'm repeating it here, is that, you know, this path that I'm on now is what it is, but I do want to remain, you know, engaged with academia, because it allows me also to think about some of the decisions that I'm taking and some of the advice that I'm providing to cabinet and also to the government. So it's important that we remain engaged. And thank you so much. I feel extremely honored that you know, you'd allowed me to be this first speaker, and I hope that you will keep me informed about all the other talks that you'll be having, so that I can also maybe engage with some of them, but also sit through some of them. So I'll be really delighted, even if not all, that I get invited to some of the others, so that I can be a participant.
Wonderful.
I'm extremely indebted to you as well. So thank you very much, Professor Praagh, for such an inspiring engagement as well.
Oh, that's
And
really wonderful.
Vishakha, you were great, and I think you're making a great doctoral student. Go out there and transform the world.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to engage with you.
Thank you.
And Yvonne, we've been talking about you coming as a retreat to think and write whenever you have a break from your very busy career. So O'Brien platform, we've been talking about it, and it'll be an honor for us to have you with us for a length of time. So please
certainly. I mean, once we're completely sure about where Corona is taking us, and we can now freely start traveling, I would certainly like to come through. And I mean, it doesn't just have to be, it could be a number of things, because I love teaching, you know, and engaging with students, and maybe also consider whether or not that would be a place where I could have my doctoral studies. So yeah, so let's keep that conversation open, Professor, and I would like to really think about it towards, you know, in the course of next year. Let's see how things go, and I would be delighted to join the faculty and of course the center.
Wow, we are very, very lucky. Okay. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
all right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Elise, I only saw your email. I didn't say hello to you. Hi.
Well, thank you so much for coming. This has been such a joy to listen to and everything. So thank you again for all
very much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.